I thought it was just another routine vehicle inspection. My brother's old Honda needed its annual safety check, and I'd volunteered to handle the paperwork while he was deployed overseas. But when the mechanics started listing everything that was supposedly wrong with a car I'd personally maintained for months, I stayed quiet. When his supervisor joined in with a smirk about women who don't know anything about cars, I kept my mouth shut. It wasn't until the head inspector walked in and his face went white as he snapped to attention that anyone realized they'd been talking down to Admiral Sarah Thompson, the woman who'd overseen the maintenance of the Navy's entire Pacific Fleet. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning fog hadn't lifted yet when I pulled into Morrison's auto inspection on the outskirts of Clearwater. The building looked exactly like every other state-certified inspection station I'd ever seen. Concrete floors stained with decades of motor oil, fluorescent lights that flickered sporadically, and that particular smell of rubber, exhaust, and industrial cleaner that seemed to live in the walls themselves. I'd been awake since 4:30, a habit that 32 years in the Navy had burned into my DNA, and the inspection station had just opened when I arrived with my brother Marcus's 2018 Honda Accord. Marcus was currently serving his second tour in Afghanistan, and when he'd asked me to handle his car's annual inspection while he was deployed, I'd agreed without hesitation. It seemed like such a simple favor. Take the car in, get the paperwork signed, keep his registration current so he'd have one less thing to worry about when he returned. I'd been maintaining the vehicle myself since he left 6 months ago, changing the oil every 3,000 miles, checking the tire pressure weekly, replacing the air filter, ensuring the brake fluid stayed topped off. The car ran like clockwork because I'd made sure it did. At 63, I supposed I looked like exactly what the paperwork said I was, a woman dropping off her brother's car for inspection. My gray hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and I wore jeans and a plain blue sweater that had seen better days. Nothing about my appearance suggested that I'd spent the last 3 decades commanding naval vessels and overseeing maintenance operations for ships worth billions of dollars. Nothing indicated that I'd retired just 8 months ago with the rank of Admiral, or that the muscle memory I used to check Marcus's tire pressure was the same I'd developed inspecting aircraft carriers. The waiting area was exactly what I'd expected. Mismatched plastic chairs around a coffee table covered with automotive magazines from 2 years ago, a television mounted in the corner playing morning news at barely audible volume, and a vending machine that hummed constantly but dispensed lukewarm sodas. I settled into one of the chairs with a book and prepared to wait while they performed what should have been a straightforward 30-minute inspection. 20 minutes later, a young man in coveralls emerged from the garage bay. He couldn't have been more than 25, with grease-stained fingers and the kind of confident swagger that comes from knowing just enough to be dangerous. His name tag read Tyler, and he approached me with an expression that immediately put me on alert. "Ma'am, I've got some bad news about your vehicle," he announced, consulting a clipboard with exaggerated authority. "We found several issues that are going to prevent it from passing inspection." I set my book aside and gave him my full attention. What kind of issues? Tyler launched into a detailed explanation that would have been impressive if it had been accurate. According to him, the brake pads were worn beyond safe limits, the alignment was severely off, the exhaust system had multiple leaks, and the battery terminals were corroded to the point of being dangerous. He estimated the repairs would cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $800, and he was happy to provide a detailed quote if I was interested in having their shop handle the work. I listened to his entire presentation without interruption, the same way I'd listened to countless briefings over the years from junior officers who thought they knew more than they actually did. The difference was that this time I knew he was either incompetent or lying because I'd personally inspected every system he'd mentioned just 3 days earlier. "Can you show me these issues?" I asked calmly. Tyler's expression shifted slightly, like he hadn't expected me to ask questions. "Well, ma'am, it's a liability issue for customers to be in the work area, but I can assure you these are serious safety concerns." That was my first red flag. Any legitimate inspection facility should be willing to show customers exactly what problems they'd identified, especially when those problems supposedly pose safety risks. I'd been around enough automotive maintenance to know that transparency was the hallmark of honest mechanics, while pressure tactics and restricted access usually indicated something less than ethical. "I understand safety protocols," I replied, "but I'd like to see what you're referring to before we discuss repairs." Tyler shifted uncomfortably and glanced back toward the garage. "Let me get my supervisor. He can explain the technical details better than I can." He disappeared into the work area, leaving me alone with the distinct impression that something wasn't quite right about this situation. I'd encountered enough questionable contractors over the years to recognize the signs: vague explanations, pressure for immediate decisions, reluctance to provide detailed information. In the Navy, I'd learned to trust my instincts when something felt off, and every instinct I had was currently sending up warning signals. 5 minutes later, Tyler returned with a man in his 40s who carried himself with the kind of authority that suggested he was either the owner or the general manager. His coveralls were cleaner than Tyler's, and his demeanor was more polished, but there was something in his eyes that reminded me of every bureaucrat I'd ever dealt with who thought they could intimidate people into accepting whatever they were selling. "Mr. he began, consulting the paperwork. "Thompson," I supplied. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm Bill Morrison, and this is my facility. Tyler's filled me in on the situation with your Honda, and I'm afraid he's right about the extent of the problems. These are significant safety issues that we can't legally overlook during the inspection process." Morrison had the smooth delivery of someone who'd given this speech many times before. He explained that while he understood the repairs seemed expensive, safety had to be the top priority, and he couldn't in good conscience pass a vehicle that posed risks to me or other drivers. He offered a 10% discount on parts if I decided to have the work done immediately, and he assured me that their technicians were highly qualified to handle all the necessary repairs. I listened to his presentation with the same patient attention I'd given Tyler, noting the subtle pressure tactics and the way he positioned himself as doing me a favor by identifying these supposed problems. What struck me most was how confident he seemed that I would simply accept his assessment without question, as if my appearance and gender meant I couldn't possibly understand automotive systems well enough to challenge his expertise. "Mr. Morrison," I said when he finished, "I'd like to see these problems for myself before we proceed." His expression tightened slightly. "As Tyler mentioned, insurance regulations don't allow customers in the work area, but I can provide you with photographs of the issues if that would help." That was my second red flag. Legitimate inspection facilities typically had no problem allowing customers to observe their work, especially when significant safety issues were involved. The offer of photographs instead of direct observation suggested they either had something to hide or they were hoping I'd be satisfied with evidence that could be easily manipulated. "I've worked around vehicles before," I replied. "I understand safety protocols, and I'm comfortable in workshop environments." Morrison and Tyler exchanged a look that I recognized from my years in command. It was the expression people got when they realized their standard approach might not work, but they weren't quite ready to change tactics yet. Morrison cleared his throat and adopted what I assumed was meant to be a reassuring tone. "Mrs. Thompson, I appreciate that you might have some experience with cars, but these are complex systems that require specialized training to evaluate properly. What might look fine to someone without technical background could actually be quite dangerous." There it was, the assumption that because I was a woman of a certain age, I couldn't possibly have the knowledge or experience to understand what they were telling me. It was the same condescending attitude I'd encountered throughout my early naval career, when junior officers would explain basic maritime concepts to me as if I hadn't spent years studying them at the Naval Academy. I could have told them right then about my background. I could have mentioned that I'd overseen maintenance operations for vessels that made their inspection facility look like a toy garage. I could have explained that I'd personally signed off on safety inspections for ships carrying nuclear reactors and weapon systems worth more than their entire business. But I'd learned long ago that sometimes the best way to gather information was to let people reveal who they really were when they think they have the advantage. "I understand your position," I said instead, "but before I authorize any repairs, I need to see exactly what problems you've identified." Morrison's patience was clearly wearing thin. "Ma'am, with all due respect, this is a state-certified inspection facility. Our technicians are licensed professionals, and our assessments are backed by 20 years of experience in the automotive industry. These aren't matters of opinion." Tyler nodded enthusiastically. Right, and no offense, but most people don't really understand how brake systems work or what constitutes a safety hazard. That's why we're here to handle the technical stuff. I felt that familiar surge of irritation that came with being patronized by people who had no idea what they were talking about. It was the same feeling I'd experienced countless times over the years when contractors or suppliers had tried to overwhelm me with technical jargon, assuming I'd be too intimidated to ask detailed questions. The difference was that this time I wasn't wearing a uniform that immediately commanded respect, and these men had decided that meant they could treat me like someone who didn't understand basic mechanical principles. "Mr. Morrison," I said, my voice taking on the tone I'd once used during budget meetings with Pentagon officials who tried to sell me substandard equipment, "I'm not questioning your certifications or your experience, but I am requesting to see the specific issues you've identified before I authorize $800 in repairs." Morrison's expression hardened. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm trying to be patient here, but you're asking me to interrupt my technician's work to provide a guided tour for someone who, frankly, isn't going to understand what she's looking at anyway. These are safety issues, not cosmetic problems. You can either trust our professional assessment or take your business elsewhere." That was when I knew for certain that something was wrong. No legitimate business owner would respond to reasonable customer questions with threats and condescension, especially when those questions involved significant repair costs. Morrison was either running a scam, or he was so arrogant that he genuinely believed customers should accept his word without question. "I see," I said quietly, "and if I choose to take my business elsewhere, what happens to the inspection paperwork?" Tyler jumped in before Morrison could answer. "Well, we've already started the process, so you'd still need to pay the inspection fee, and we'd have to note on the paperwork that the vehicle failed to meet safety standards." Another red flag. Inspection fees were typically only charged after successful completion of the process, and threatening to mark a vehicle as failed simply because a customer asked questions was a clear abuse of the system. I was beginning to understand that Morrison's auto inspection operated on the assumption that most customers would be too intimidated or uninformed to challenge their practices. I stood up from the plastic chair and gathered my purse and book. "I think I'd like to speak with your most senior technician before we proceed." Morrison's face flushed slightly. "Mrs. Thompson, I am the senior technician. I own this facility, and my assessment is final. You can either authorize the repairs or find somewhere else to get your inspection done." That was when the main door to the facility opened and another man walked in. He was probably in his late 50s, wearing a naval uniform that I recognized immediately. His rank insignia indicated he was a chief petty officer, and something about his bearing suggested he was active duty rather than retired. He approached the counter with the purposeful stride of someone who was used to having his time respected and his business handled efficiently. "I'm here for a pickup," he announced to no one in particular. "Chief Patterson, scheduled for 10:30. Morrison glanced at his watch and muttered something under his breath about scheduling. He turned to Tyler with visible irritation. "Handle the chief's pickup. I need to finish dealing with this situation." As Tyler headed toward the garage to retrieve Chief Patterson's vehicle, Morrison turned back to me with an expression that suggested his patience was completely exhausted. "Mrs. Thompson, I need a decision. Are you authorizing these repairs or not?" I was about to respond when Chief Patterson stepped closer, his attention caught by something in the conversation. Military personnel develop a highly tuned sense for when situations are about to go sideways, and something in Morrison's tone had apparently triggered his professional instincts. "Excuse me," Chief Patterson said politely, "but did I hear you mention safety issues with a vehicle inspection?" Morrison turned to face him with a completely different demeanor. The condescending tone disappeared, replaced by the respectful attention that civilian contractors typically showed to military personnel. Yes, Chief, we've identified several serious problems with this lady's Honda, but she's reluctant to authorize the necessary repairs. Chief Patterson looked at me with the kind of professional assessment that military people use when they're trying to understand a situation quickly. What kind of problems are we talking about? Morrison launched into the same list he'd given me: brake pads, alignment, exhaust leaks, battery corrosion, but this time his explanation was more detailed and technical, as if he assumed Chief Patterson would understand concepts that he'd implied were too complex for me to grasp. I watched this interaction with growing anger, not just at Morrison's obvious discrimination, but at the way he was using Chief Patterson's presence to validate his position. He clearly expected the chief to support his assessment simply because they were both men who understood automotive systems, while I was just a woman who couldn't possibly comprehend such technical matters. Chief Patterson listened to Morrison's explanation with the same patient attention he'd probably learned to give briefings from superior officers. When Morrison finished, the chief turned to me with a respectful expression. "Ma'am, have you had a chance to see these issues for yourself?" "That's what I've been requesting," I replied, "but Mr. Morrison feels it's unnecessary since I wouldn't understand what I was looking at anyway." Chief Patterson's expression shifted slightly. As someone who'd spent his career in an environment where safety inspections were matters of life and death, he clearly understood the importance of transparency and verification. "Mr. Morrison, is there a reason the customer can't observe the inspection process?" Morrison's confident demeanor faltered slightly. "Well, it's a liability issue, and frankly, most customers don't have the technical background to understand what they're seeing." "I see," Chief Patterson said quietly, "and you've determined that Mrs. Thompson, that Mrs. Thompson doesn't have sufficient technical background based on what criteria?" There was something in the chief's tone that made Morrison realize he was walking into dangerous territory. Military personnel were trained to recognize discrimination and unprofessional conduct, and Chief Patterson was clearly beginning to understand what kind of situation he'd walked into. "I mean, it's just standard procedure," Morrison said, his voice less confident than before. "We handle the technical assessments, customers handle the financial decisions." Chief Patterson nodded slowly. "I understand. Mrs. Thompson, if you don't mind me asking, what's your experience with vehicle maintenance?" It was a simple question, asked with genuine respect, and it offered me the opportunity to provide information that might change the entire dynamic of the conversation. I could have mentioned my naval background, my experience with complex mechanical systems, my years of overseeing maintenance operations for equipment far more sophisticated than anything in Morrison's garage. Instead, I decided to let the situation develop a little further. I wanted to see exactly how far Morrison was willing to push his assumptions, and I was curious about how Chief Patterson would respond if Morrison continued to insist that technical knowledge was beyond my capabilities. "I've worked around mechanical systems most of my life," I said carefully. "I'm comfortable with diagnostic procedures and safety inspections." Chief Patterson nodded as if this was exactly the kind of background he'd expected. Morrison, however, looked like he was growing more frustrated with each exchange. "Look," Morrison said, his voice taking on an edge of irritation, "I don't know what kind of game this is, but I run a business here. I've identified legitimate safety issues with this vehicle, and I need a decision about repairs. I can't spend all day explaining basic automotive concepts to customers who think they know more than certified technicians." That was the moment when Chief Patterson's expression hardened. Military personnel had very little tolerance for disrespect toward civilians, especially when that disrespect was based on assumptions about gender or technical competence. The chief's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath it. "Mr. Morrison, Mrs. Thompson has made a reasonable request to observe the inspection process. In my experience, customers who ask detailed questions usually have good reasons for doing so." Morrison's face was beginning to flush with anger. "Chief, I appreciate that you're trying to help, but this is my facility and these are my procedures. I've been doing automotive inspections since before this lady ever thought about looking under a hood." The condescension in his voice was unmistakable now, and I could see Chief Patterson registering every word. Military culture placed enormous emphasis on treating people with respect regardless of their background, and Morrison's attitude was clearly violating every principle the chief had been trained to uphold. I was about to say something when Tyler returned from the garage, pushing a cart with Chief Patterson's vehicle keys and paperwork. But instead of approaching the counter, he stopped short when he noticed the tension in the room. "Everything okay, Mr. Morrison?" Tyler asked nervously. "Everything's fine," Morrison snapped, "just dealing with a customer who thinks she knows more about car repair than people who do this for a living." That was when I realized the situation had reached a point where I needed to either walk away or change the dynamic completely. Morrison had made his position clear. He was going to treat me with disrespect until I either accepted his assessment without question or took my business elsewhere. Chief Patterson was clearly uncomfortable with Morrison's attitude, but he was also in an awkward position as a customer trying not to interfere with someone else's business transaction. I looked around the waiting area one more time, taking in the mismatched furniture and the flickering fluorescent lights, and I made my decision. I'd spent 32 years in the Navy dealing with contractors who thought they could intimidate me, suppliers who assumed I didn't understand technical specifications, and bureaucrats who believed rank and experience mattered less than gender and appearance. I was done being patient with Morrison's assumptions about what I did or didn't understand about mechanical systems. "Mr. Morrison," I said, my voice taking on the tone I'd once used during congressional budget hearings when contractors tried to oversell unnecessary equipment, "I think there's been a misunderstanding here." Morrison crossed his arms and stared at me with the kind of expression I'd seen countless times from people who believed they held all the cards in a negotiation. "What kind of misunderstanding would that be, Mrs. Thompson?" "The kind where you've assumed that because I'm a woman asking questions about automotive systems, I must not understand how they work." I kept my voice level, professional, the same tone I'd used during countless meetings with defense contractors who'd made similar assumptions. "You've decided that my request to see the problems you've identified is unreasonable, and you've concluded that I should simply accept your assessment without verification." Morrison's face darkened. "Now wait just a minute. I never said anything about you being a woman. This is about customer safety and professional procedures." "Is it?" I asked. "Because when Chief Patterson asked you the same questions I did, you provided detailed technical explanations. When I asked, you told me I wouldn't understand what I was looking at." Chief Patterson had been listening to this exchange with growing concern, and now he stepped forward slightly. "Mrs. Thompson, if you don't mind me asking, what's your background with mechanical systems?" It was time to stop playing games. I'd given Morrison every opportunity to treat me with basic professional respect, and he'd chosen instead to double down on his assumptions about my capabilities. I turned to face Chief Patterson directly, letting my posture shift into the bearing I'd carried for 3 decades in uniform. "Chief, I'm Admiral Sarah Thompson, United States Navy, retired. I spent the last 8 years of my career overseeing maintenance operations for the Pacific Fleet, which included responsibility for vessels ranging from destroyers to aircraft carriers. Before that, I commanded the USS Gulf, a guided missile cruiser, where I was personally responsible for the operational readiness of propulsion systems, weapon systems, and life support equipment that make the mechanical systems in this facility look like children's toys." The silence that followed my statement was absolute. Chief Patterson's eyes widened, and I watched him process what I'd just told him. Tyler's mouth actually fell open, and he looked like he was trying to figure out if I was telling the truth or having some kind of breakdown. Morrison just stared at me with an expression that suggested his brain was struggling to reconcile what he'd heard with what he'd assumed about the woman in jeans and a sweater who'd walked into his shop that morning. Chief Patterson was the first to recover. His entire demeanor changed in an instant, his posture straightening into something that approached attention. "Admiral Thompson, ma'am, I apologize. I had no idea." "There's nothing for you to apologize for, Chief. You've been nothing but professional and respectful since you arrived." I glanced meaningfully at Morrison. Unlike some people in this facility, Morrison's face had gone through several color changes during my explanation, settling on a pale shade that suggested he was beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistake. "Admiral, you're really in the Navy?" I was in the Navy for 32 years, Mr. Morrison. I retired 8 months ago. And during that time, I signed off on safety inspections for equipment worth billions of dollars, including nuclear propulsion systems and weapons platforms that required precision maintenance tolerances you couldn't achieve with the tools in this entire building. Tyler looked like he wanted to disappear into the concrete floor. But you didn't say anything about being in the military. I shouldn't have needed to, I replied. A customer's request to see identified problems should be honored regardless of their background. Professional courtesy and transparency aren't privileges reserved for people with military experience. Chief Patterson was shaking his head in disbelief. Admiral, with all due respect, what you've described here is completely unacceptable. No customer should be treated this way, but especially not someone with your service record. Morrison finally found his voice again. Look, I think there's been a misunderstanding here. I never meant to be disrespectful. Mr. Morrison, you told me I wouldn't understand what I was looking at. You refused to show me the problems you claimed to have found. You threatened to mark my brother's vehicle as failed simply because I asked questions. You explicitly stated that technical knowledge was beyond my capabilities. I kept my voice calm, but I could feel the command authority that had carried me through decades of leadership rising to the surface. Which part of that would you like to call a misunderstanding? Before Morrison could answer, the front door opened again, and 2 more people entered the facility. The first was a woman in her 30s wearing the kind of business attire that suggested she worked in an office environment. The second was a man in his 40s wearing what I immediately recognized as a Navy uniform with Lieutenant Commander insignia.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The woman approached the counter while the Lieutenant Commander hung back, checking his phone. I'm here to pick up a Toyota Camry. The inspection should be ready. Morrison looked grateful for the interruption. Yes, ma'am, let me check on that for you. But the Lieutenant Commander had noticed Chief Patterson and me, and something about our conversation had caught his attention. Military personnel develop a sense for when situations involve other service members, and he stepped closer with the kind of polite interest that suggested he was trying to understand the context. Excuse me, Chief, he said to Patterson. Is everything all right here? Chief Patterson glanced at me, clearly unsure whether he should explain the situation. I nodded slightly, giving him permission to proceed. Commander, this is Admiral Thompson, retired. She's been dealing with some customer service issues that I think you'd find concerning. The Lieutenant Commander's attention shifted to me immediately, and I watched his expression change as he processed what Chief Patterson had said. Admiral Thompson, ma'am, Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez, it's an honor to meet you. I appreciated his courtesy, but I was more interested in resolving the situation with Morrison than exchanging pleasantries with another officer. Commander Rodriguez, I'm just trying to get a vehicle inspection completed properly. Rodriguez looked around the facility, taking in the tension that was still thick in the air. Is there a problem with the inspection process? Before I could answer, Tyler jumped in with what I assumed was meant to be damage control. No, sir, everything's fine, just some confusion about safety procedures. Rodriguez looked at Tyler with the kind of expression officers reserve for enlisted personnel who interrupt conversations between higher-ranking individuals. I wasn't addressing you. Morrison stepped forward, clearly hoping to regain control of the narrative. Commander, there's been a simple misunderstanding. Mrs. Admiral Thompson had some questions about our inspection findings, and we were just working through the technical details. What kind of technical details? Rodriguez asked, his voice taking on the tone that suggested he was beginning to understand that this might not be as simple as Morrison was suggesting. I decided it was time to provide a clear summary of what had happened. Commander, I brought my brother's Honda in for a routine safety inspection. Mr. Morrison's technician identified $800 worth of supposed problems that I know for a fact don't exist because I personally maintain the vehicle. When I requested to see these problems, Mr. Morrison refused, telling me I wouldn't understand what I was looking at anyway. He then threatened to mark the vehicle as failed if I didn't immediately authorize the repairs or take my business elsewhere. Rodriguez's expression darkened as I spoke. Military officers were trained to recognize fraud and unethical business practices, especially when they targeted service members or their families. Mr. Morrison, is this an accurate description of what happened? Morrison was beginning to look desperate. Commander, I think there's been a communication breakdown here. We identified legitimate safety concerns and we were just trying to explain the technical aspects. By refusing to show the customer what problems you found? Rodriguez's voice carried the kind of authority that came from years of command experience. And by telling a retired admiral that she wouldn't understand automotive systems? The woman who'd come in to pick up her Toyota had been listening to this conversation with growing interest, and now she stepped closer. Excuse me, did you say he told an admiral she wouldn't understand car repairs? Rodriguez nodded grimly. That appears to be exactly what happened. The woman looked at Morrison with an expression of disgust. That's horrible. I've been bringing my cars here for 2 years, but if this is how you treat customers, I'm taking my business elsewhere. Morrison was clearly beginning to panic. The situation was spiraling beyond his control, and he was facing the prospect of losing customers and dealing with complaints that could reach his licensing board. Look, everyone, I think we're all overreacting here. This was just a simple miscommunication. Mr. Morrison, I said, my voice taking on the tone I'd once used during disciplinary hearings for officers who'd violated regulations. There was no miscommunication. You made assumptions about my technical knowledge based on my appearance, and when I asked reasonable questions about your assessment, you responded with condescension and threats. That's not miscommunication. That's discrimination and unprofessional conduct. Commander Rodriguez was nodding as I spoke. Admiral, what would you like to see happen here? It was a simple question, but it carried significant weight. Rodriguez was essentially asking me to dictate the resolution of the situation, acknowledging my authority to determine what constituted appropriate corrective action. It was the kind of deference that military officers showed to superior ranks, even in civilian settings. I want to see the problems that supposedly exist with my brother's vehicle, I said. I want Mr. Morrison to personally show me each issue he's identified, explain exactly what's wrong, and provide documentation that supports his assessment. And I want him to do it with the same level of professional courtesy he would show to any other customer. Morrison looked like he was trapped in a corner with nowhere out. He clearly couldn't show me problems that didn't exist, but he also couldn't admit that he'd been lying about the vehicle's condition without facing serious consequences for fraudulent business practices. Admiral, he said, his voice much less confident than it had been an hour earlier. I think maybe we should have one of our senior technicians take another look at your vehicle. Sometimes there can be variations in assessment procedures. I almost smiled at his attempt to save face. Mr. Morrison, are you suggesting that your original assessment might have been incorrect? I'm saying that maybe we should double-check our findings to make sure we haven't missed anything important. Chief Patterson had been watching this entire exchange with fascination, and now he stepped forward. Mr. Morrison, in my experience, when professionals need to double-check findings that involve $800 in repairs, it usually means the original assessment was seriously flawed. The woman waiting for her Toyota pickup nodded emphatically. If you're not sure about your own inspection results, how can customers trust anything you tell them? Morrison was beginning to sweat, despite the cool morning air in the facility. Let me go check on the vehicle personally.
I'm sure we can resolve any confusion quickly. As Morrison disappeared into the garage area, Commander Rodriguez turned to me with an expression of professional concern. Admiral, this kind of treatment is completely unacceptable. Have you considered filing a complaint with the state licensing board? I'm more interested in making sure this doesn't happen to other customers, I replied, especially military families who might not have the background to challenge questionable assessments. Rodriguez nodded gravely. That's exactly what I was thinking. Service members and their families are often targeted by unscrupulous contractors who assume they won't push back against inflated repair estimates. Tyler had been standing near the counter during this entire conversation, looking increasingly uncomfortable as he realized the magnitude of what he and Morrison had walked into. Now he cleared his throat nervously. "Ma'am, Admiral Thompson, I want to apologize for my part in this. I should have been more professional, and I should have shown you the problems we identified instead of just reading from a list." I appreciated his attempt at accountability, but I wanted to make sure he understood the broader implications of what had happened. "Tyler, the issue isn't just that you failed to show me specific problems. The issue is that you and Mr. Morrison made assumptions about my capabilities based on my gender and age, and then you used those assumptions to justify treating me with disrespect." Tyler nodded miserably. "Yes, ma'am, I understand that now." "Do you?" I asked. "Because this isn't about my military background or my technical experience. This is about basic customer service and professional courtesy. Every person who walks into this facility deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of what they look like or what you assume about their knowledge." Commander Rodriguez was listening to this exchange with approval. "Admiral, you are absolutely right. Military service aside, no customer should face this kind of treatment." That was when Morrison emerged from the garage, his expression grim, and his coveralls somehow dirtier than they'd been when he'd gone back to examine my brother's Honda. He approached our group with the demeanor of someone who just discovered that everything he thought he knew about a situation was completely wrong. "Admiral Thompson," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "I've personally inspected your brother's vehicle, and I need to inform you that our original assessment was incomplete." I waited for him to continue, maintaining the kind of patient silence that had served me well during years of dealing with subordinates who needed to confess mistakes or admit errors in judgment. Morrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. "The vehicle is actually in excellent condition. The brake pads have at least another 10,000 miles of wear remaining. The alignment is within manufacturer specifications. The exhaust system is sound, and the battery terminals are clean and properly maintained." The silence that followed his admission was profound. Chief Patterson looked like he was trying to decide whether to be angry or amazed. Commander Rodriguez was shaking his head in disbelief. The woman waiting for her Toyota was staring at Morrison with an expression that suggested she was reevaluating every interaction she'd ever had with his facility. "So you're saying there are no safety issues with the vehicle?" I asked, my voice neutral but carrying undertones that suggested Morrison needed to choose his next words very carefully. "That's correct, ma'am. The Honda passes inspection without any required repairs." Tyler was looking back and forth between Morrison and me like he was watching a tennis match, clearly trying to understand how the situation had changed so dramatically in the space of 30 minutes. "Mr. Morrison," I said, letting my voice carry the authority I'd developed over 3 decades of command, "I'm curious about something. When you told me the vehicle had $800 worth of safety problems, were you mistaken or were you lying?" Morrison's face went through several color changes as he processed the implications of my question. Either answer would be devastating for his business and his professional reputation, but I wanted him to understand that there were consequences for the kind of behavior he'd displayed. "Admiral, I think there was a genuine error in our initial assessment process," he said finally. "A genuine error that conveniently disappeared when you realized you were dealing with someone who couldn't be easily intimidated?" Commander Rodriguez's voice carried the kind of skepticism that military officers developed after years of dealing with contractors who tried to oversell unnecessary services. Morrison looked around the room at the faces staring at him, clearly realizing that every person present understood exactly what had happened and why his reassessment had produced such dramatically different results. "I want to make this right," he said desperately. "There's no charge for today's inspection, and I'd like to offer Admiral Thompson a sincere apology for any confusion or inconvenience." "Mr. Morrison," I said, my voice taking on the tone I'd once used during congressional hearings when witnesses tried to minimize serious failures in military procurement processes. "This wasn't confusion or inconvenience. This was attempted fraud, discrimination, and unprofessional conduct. An apology doesn't address the systemic problems with how you operate this business." Before Morrison could respond, the door to the facility opened again and another man entered. He was wearing civilian clothes, but something about his bearing immediately suggested military background. He was probably in his 60s, with graying hair and the kind of posture that spoke of decades in uniform. He approached the counter and addressed Tyler directly. "I'm here for a pickup, Master Chief Reynolds, scheduled for 11:15. Chief Patterson's attention immediately focused on the newcomer. "Master Chief Reynolds, did you serve on the USS Constellation?" Reynolds turned toward Patterson with interest. 22 years ago. Chief Patterson, right? You were on the engineering crew." "Yes, Master Chief. Good to see you again." Patterson gestured toward me. "Master Chief, I'd like you to meet Admiral Thompson, retired." Reynolds' demeanor shifted immediately as he turned to face me. Despite being in civilian clothes, his posture straightened into something approaching attention, and he extended his hand with the kind of respect that senior enlisted personnel always showed to flag officers. "Admiral Thompson, it's an honor to meet you, ma'am." "The pleasure is mine, Master Chief. Thank you for your service." Reynolds glanced around the facility, clearly sensing that he'd walked into the middle of something significant. "Is everything all right here?" Commander Rodriguez stepped forward. "Master Chief, Admiral Thompson has been dealing with some serious customer service issues that I think you'd find concerning." Reynolds' expression immediately became more serious. "What kind of issues?" I provided a brief summary of what had happened, watching Reynolds' face darken as I described Morrison's conduct and his attempted fraud. By the time I finished, the Master Chief was looking at Morrison with the kind of expression that senior enlisted personnel reserved for contractors who tried to cheat the military.
"Let me understand this correctly," Reynolds said, his voice carrying the authority that came from decades of leadership in the Navy's most demanding environments. "You attempted to charge Admiral Thompson $800 for repairs that don't exist? You refused to show her the problems you claim to have found, and you told her she wouldn't understand automotive systems because she's a woman?" Morrison looked like he wanted to disappear through the concrete floor. "Master Chief, I think there's been a serious misunderstanding about what happened here." Reynolds turned to Chief Patterson with a questioning look. "Chief, is that an accurate summary?" "Yes, Master Chief. I witnessed most of it personally." Reynolds nodded slowly, then turned back to Morrison with an expression that could have frozen the desert. "Son, Admiral Thompson has forgotten more about mechanical systems than you'll ever know. She's overseen maintenance operations for nuclear-powered vessels that make anything in this garage look like a child's bicycle. The fact that you treated her with disrespect is bad enough, but attempting to defraud her is completely unacceptable." Morrison was beginning to look like a man who realized he'd made a catastrophic mistake that was going to have lasting consequences. "I never intended any disrespect toward the Admiral's service." "Your intentions don't matter," Reynolds replied sharply. "Your actions do. And your actions demonstrate either incompetence or deliberate fraud, neither of which is acceptable when dealing with military families." That was when Tyler stepped forward, his face pale but his expression determined. "Master Chief, Admiral Thompson, I need to say something." Everyone turned to look at him, and I could see that he was struggling with some kind of internal conflict. "Mr. Morrison, I can't do this anymore. The Admiral's car was fine when we inspected it this morning. You told me to write up problems that didn't exist because you figured she'd pay for repairs without asking questions." The silence that followed Tyler's confession was absolute. Morrison's face went white, then red, then white again as he realized that his own employee had just confirmed what everyone already suspected. "Tyler, you don't know what you're talking about," Morrison said desperately. "Yes, I do," Tyler replied, his voice gaining strength. "You've been running this scam for months, targeting customers who you think won't challenge your assessments. Older women, college students, anyone you figure doesn't know enough about cars to push back." Commander Rodriguez was shaking his head in disgust. "Mr. Morrison, are you going to try to claim this is another misunderstanding?" Morrison looked around the room at the faces staring at him, clearly realizing that every person present now understood exactly what kind of operation he'd been running. His shoulders sagged as he apparently gave up any pretense of maintaining his innocence.
"Look," he said finally, "business has been tough. The economy, competition from chain stores, rising costs. Sometimes you have to find ways to make ends meet." By defrauding customers, Master Chief Reynolds' voice carried the kind of moral authority that came from a lifetime of serving with honor and integrity. By targeting people you think are vulnerable to intimidation? "Mr. Morrison," I said, my voice taking on the tone I'd once used during court-martial proceedings for officers who'd violated their oaths of service. "You've just admitted to running a fraudulent business operation. You've confessed to targeting customers based on discriminatory assumptions about their knowledge and capabilities. And you've done it in front of multiple witnesses, including active-duty military personnel." Morrison realized too late that his attempt to explain his motivations had actually made his situation much worse. "Admiral, I think we can work something out here, maybe some kind of arrangement that benefits everyone." "The only arrangement I'm interested in," I replied, "is ensuring that you face appropriate consequences for what you've done, and that other customers don't fall victim to your fraudulent practices." Chief Patterson was nodding emphatically. "Admiral, this kind of operation specifically targets military families. We need to make sure the appropriate authorities are notified." Commander Rodriguez pulled out his phone. "I'm calling the base legal office. They need to know about this immediately." As Rodriguez began dialing, Master Chief Reynolds turned to Morrison with an expression of complete disgust. "Son, you picked the wrong person to mess with today. But more importantly, you chose to dishonor yourself and your business by preying on people who served their country with distinction." Morrison was beginning to realize that his problems were just beginning, not ending. Tyler had confirmed his fraudulent practices in front of multiple witnesses, and those witnesses included military personnel who had both the authority and the motivation to ensure that his conduct faced serious consequences. The woman who'd been waiting for her Toyota pickup had been listening to this entire exchange with growing outrage. Now she stepped forward and addressed Morrison directly. "I want my inspection fee refunded immediately, and I want documentation that shows exactly what work was performed on my vehicle. If you've been running scams on other customers, I need to know whether I've been cheated too." Morrison nodded miserably. "Yes, ma'am. Tyler can handle that for you right away." As Tyler began processing the refund and gathering paperwork for the Toyota owner, Master Chief Reynolds approached me with an expression of profound respect. "Admiral Thompson, on behalf of the Navy family, I want to apologize for what you've experienced here today. This kind of treatment is completely unacceptable, and it doesn't represent the values we serve to protect." "Master Chief, you have nothing to apologize for. Your conduct and Chief Patterson's conduct have been exemplary throughout this entire situation." Reynolds nodded, then turned to face Morrison one final time. "Mr. Morrison, I want you to understand something. Admiral Thompson has served this country with distinction for over 3 decades. She's earned the respect of everyone she's ever commanded, and she deserves nothing less than complete professional courtesy from every business she enters." Morrison nodded weakly. "Yes, Master Chief, I understand." "I hope you do," Reynolds replied. "Because if word of this spreads through the military community, and it will, your reputation will never recover." As if to emphasize his point, Commander Rodriguez finished his phone call and approached our group with a grim expression. "Admiral, Base Legal wants to speak with you at your earliest convenience. They're also planning to issue a warning to all personnel about this facility's business practices." Morrison's face went completely white as he realized that his fraudulent operation was about to be exposed to the entire local military community. "Commander, is there any way we can handle this quietly? I'm willing to make full restitution for any problems." "Mr. Morrison," Rodriguez replied coldly, "the time for quiet resolution was before you attempted to defraud a retired admiral and confessed to running systematic scams against military families. This is now a matter for the appropriate authorities." I looked around the facility one final time, taking in the mismatched furniture, the flickering lights, and the faces of people who just witnessed a complete reversal of power dynamics.
Morrison had started the morning confident in his ability to intimidate and exploit customers he perceived as vulnerable. He was ending it facing potential criminal charges and the complete destruction of his business reputation. "Look," he said finally, "business has been tough. The economy, competition from chain stores, rising costs. Sometimes you have to find ways to make ends meet." By defrauding customers, Master Chief Reynolds' voice carried the kind of moral authority that came from a lifetime of serving with honor and integrity. By targeting people you think are vulnerable to intimidation? "Mr. Morrison," I said, my voice taking on the tone I'd once used during court-martial proceedings for officers who'd violated their oaths of service. "You've just admitted to running a fraudulent business operation. You've confessed to targeting customers based on discriminatory assumptions about their knowledge and capabilities. And you've done it in front of multiple witnesses, including active-duty military personnel." Morrison realized too late that his attempt to explain his motivations had actually made his situation much worse. "Admiral, I think we can work something out here, maybe some kind of arrangement that benefits everyone." "The only arrangement I'm interested in," I replied, "is ensuring that you face appropriate consequences for what you've done and that other customers don't fall victim to your fraudulent practices." Chief Patterson was nodding emphatically. "Admiral, this kind of operation specifically targets military families. We need to make sure the appropriate authorities are notified." Commander Rodriguez pulled out his phone. "I'm calling the base legal office. They need to know about this immediately." As Rodriguez began dialing, Master Chief Reynolds turned to Morrison with an expression of complete disgust. "Son, you picked the wrong person to mess with today. But more importantly, you chose to dishonor yourself and your business by preying on people who served their country with distinction." Morrison was beginning to realize that his problems were just beginning, not ending. Tyler had confirmed his fraudulent practices in front of multiple witnesses, and those witnesses included military personnel who had both the authority and the motivation to ensure that his conduct faced serious consequences. The woman who'd been waiting for her Toyota pickup had been listening to this entire exchange with growing outrage. Now she stepped forward and addressed Morrison directly. "I want my inspection fee refunded immediately, and I want documentation that shows exactly what work was performed on my vehicle."
"Mr. Morrison," I said, my voice carrying the authority I developed over 32 years of command, "I'm going to give you some advice. Contact the state licensing board immediately and report your own fraudulent practices. Cooperate fully with any investigation. Make restitution to every customer you've cheated. And understand that your conduct today has damaged not just your business, but your character." Morrison nodded silently, clearly understanding that his situation was beyond salvage and that his only hope was to minimize the consequences through cooperation and accountability. As I gathered my purse and prepared to leave, Master Chief Reynolds stepped forward one final time. Despite being in civilian clothes, he came to attention and rendered a crisp salute. "Admiral Thompson, Government Fleet Certified, ma'am. It's been an honor." I returned the salute with the precision that had become second nature over 3 decades of service, feeling the weight of respect and recognition that I'd earned through years of dedication to something larger than myself. "Thank you, Master Chief. The honor has been mutual." As I walked toward the exit, Tyler appeared at my side, his face flushed with embarrassment, but his expression determined. "Admiral Thompson, ma'am, there's something else I need to tell you." I paused near the door, turning to face him. "What is it, Tyler?" He glanced nervously toward Morrison, who was standing near the counter looking like a man watching his entire world collapse around him. "This isn't the first time this has happened. There's a woman who comes in here regularly, an older lady whose husband is deployed overseas. Mr. Morrison has been charging her for repairs she doesn't need, telling her it's for her safety while her husband is away. She always pays because she's scared something might happen to her car while she's alone." The anger that rose in me was swift and absolute. The idea that Morrison had been specifically targeting military spouses, exploiting their concerns for safety and their trust in professional assessments, was beyond contempt.
It represented a betrayal of the most fundamental principles of honor and integrity. "What's her name?" I asked, my voice carefully controlled. "Mrs. Rodriguez. Maria Rodriguez. Her husband is a staff sergeant deployed to Germany. She's got 2 young kids, and she brings her minivan in every few months because Mr. Morrison keeps telling her it needs constant repairs to stay safe." Commander Rodriguez, who had been finishing another phone call, looked up sharply. "Rodriguez? Did you say Maria Rodriguez?" Tyler nodded. "Yes, sir. She was just in last week. Mr. Morrison charged her $400 for brake work that I knew she didn't need." Commander Rodriguez's expression darkened. "That's my sister-in-law. My brother David is deployed with the 173rd Airborne. Maria's been struggling to manage everything on her own, and she's been worried sick about car problems." The room fell completely silent as everyone processed what Tyler had just revealed. Morrison had been systematically targeting the wife of an active-duty soldier, exploiting her vulnerability and her husband's absence to extract money for unnecessary repairs. It was the kind of predatory behavior that struck at the heart of military family values. "What's her name?" I asked, my voice carefully controlled. "Mrs. Rodriguez. Maria Rodriguez. Her husband is a staff sergeant deployed to Germany. She's got 2 young kids, and she brings her minivan in every few months because Mr. Morrison keeps telling her it needs constant repairs to stay safe." Commander Rodriguez, who had been finishing another phone call, looked up sharply. "Rodriguez? Did you say Maria Rodriguez?" Tyler nodded. "Yes, sir. She was just in last week. Mr. Morrison charged her $400 for brake work that I knew she didn't need." Commander Rodriguez's expression darkened. "That's my sister-in-law. My brother David is deployed with the 173rd Airborne. Maria's been struggling to manage everything on her own, and she's been worried sick about car problems." The room fell completely silent as everyone processed what Tyler had just revealed. Morrison had been systematically targeting the wife of an active-duty soldier, exploiting her vulnerability and her husband's absence to extract money for unnecessary repairs. It was the kind of predatory behavior that struck at the heart of military family values. "Mr. Morrison," I said, my voice taking on the command authority I'd used during the most serious disciplinary hearings of my career. "You've been defrauding a military spouse whose husband is serving overseas." Morrison looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. "Admiral, I never meant for it to go that far. Mrs. Rodriguez is a very nice lady, and I was just trying to make sure her vehicle was safe." "By charging her for repairs she didn't need?" Master Chief Reynolds's voice carried the kind of moral outrage that came from a lifetime of serving alongside families who sacrificed everything for their country. "By exploiting her concerns for her children's safety while her husband is deployed in harm's way?" Commander Rodriguez was already dialing another number on his phone. "Maria needs to know about this immediately. She's been skipping meals to pay for those repairs, thinking it was necessary to keep the kids safe." As Rodriguez began explaining the situation to his sister-in-law, Chief Patterson approached Morrison with an expression of complete disgust. "How many other military families have you been cheating?" Morrison's shoulders sagged under the weight of accusations that were clearly accurate. "I don't know. Maybe a dozen families over the past year." "A dozen families," I repeated, letting the words hang in the air. "Military families who trusted you to provide honest assessments of their vehicle safety." Tyler was nodding miserably. "There's Mrs. Chen, whose husband is stationed in Japan. Mr. Morrison told her she needed a new transmission, but I knew it just needed a fluid change. And Sergeant Williams brings his wife's car in whenever he's deployed, and Mr. Morrison always finds something expensive wrong with it." Each name Tyler mentioned felt like another weight added to the scale of Morrison's betrayal. These weren't random customers who could easily afford unnecessary repairs. These were military families operating on tight budgets, often dealing with the stress of deployment and separation, trusting local businesses to treat them with honesty and respect. Master Chief Reynolds was shaking his head in disbelief. "Morrison, do you have any idea what you've done? Military families move every few years, but they talk to each other. Word travels through the community like wildfire.
When people find out what you've been doing, your reputation will be destroyed forever." As if to emphasize his point, the front door opened and another customer entered. This time, it was a young woman in her 20s, carrying a baby and looking stressed in the way that suggested she was dealing with more responsibilities than she could easily manage. She approached the counter hesitantly. "Excuse me, I'm here to pick up my Honda Civic. The inspection was supposed to be ready an hour ago." Tyler looked at Morrison, clearly waiting for instructions on how to handle another customer in the middle of the unfolding disaster. Morrison gestured weakly toward the paperwork on the counter. "Mrs. Patterson, right?" Tyler said, consulting the clipboard.
"I need to let you know there's been a change in your inspection results." The young woman looked confused. "A change? What kind of change?" I stepped forward, extending my hand in introduction. "Mrs. Patterson, I'm Admiral Thompson, retired Navy. There's been a situation here today that you need to know about." Mrs. Patterson shifted the baby to her other arm and shook my hand, her expression growing more concerned. "What kind of situation?" "Mr. Morrison has been operating a fraudulent inspection scheme, charging customers for repairs they don't need. Before you pay for any work, I'd recommend having your vehicle inspected by an independent mechanic." Mrs. Patterson's face went pale. "But they told me I needed $600 in repairs. They said it wasn't safe to drive without fixing the steering system." Tyler stepped forward, his expression filled with guilt. "Ma'am, I inspected your car this morning. The steering system is fine. There's nothing wrong with your vehicle." Mrs. Patterson stared at Tyler in shock, then turned to look at Morrison with growing anger. "You were going to charge me $600 for repairs I don't need? I'm a single mother. I was going to have to borrow money from my parents to pay for this." The reality of Morrison's fraud was becoming more personal and more devastating with each revelation. He wasn't just cheating abstract customers. He was targeting people who could least afford to be exploited, people who trusted professional assessments because they had no choice. Commander Rodriguez finished his phone call and approached our group with a grim expression. "Admiral, Maria is on her way over here. She wants to confront Morrison personally about the money he's stolen from her family." Morrison looked genuinely frightened now. "Commander, maybe we could handle this without involving Mrs. Rodriguez directly. I'm willing to make full restitution." "Mr. Morrison," I said, my voice carrying the authority I developed through years of dealing with contractors who'd violated their obligations to the military. "The time for quiet resolution ended when you confessed to systematic fraud against military families. Mrs. Rodriguez has every right to confront you about what you've done to her family." Chief Patterson was consulting his phone, apparently checking messages. "Admiral, I've got 3 other Navy families asking me about Morrison's auto inspection. Word is already spreading through the base." As if summoned by his comment, the front door opened again and 2 more people entered. The first was a man in his 30s wearing a Navy uniform with Petty Officer First-Class insignia. The second was a woman in civilian clothes who carried herself with the bearing that suggested military background. The petty officer approached our group with the kind of purposeful stride that indicated he'd come here on a mission. "Is Admiral Thompson here?" I stepped forward. "I'm Admiral Thompson." "Ma'am, Petty Officer Martinez. I heard through the base network that there's been a situation here involving fraudulent practices targeting military families." "That's correct, Petty Officer." Martinez nodded grimly. "Admiral, my wife brought our SUV here 2 months ago while I was at sea. Morrison charged her $800 for engine work that she was told was critical for safety. When I got back and looked at the receipt, nothing made sense, but I figured maybe I just didn't understand the technical details." The woman with Martinez stepped forward. "I'm Sandra Martinez. That $800 was money we'd saved for our daughter's medical expenses. We had to delay her dental work because we thought the car repairs were more important." Morrison was beginning to look like a man who understood that his problems were multiplying exponentially. Each new revelation brought additional victims, additional consequences, and additional witnesses to his fraudulent practices. "Mrs. Martinez," I said, "I'm sorry for what you've experienced. Mr. Morrison has admitted to running systematic fraud operations targeting military families." Sandra Martinez turned to face Morrison with an expression of pure fury.
You stole money from my daughter's medical fund? Money my husband earned while he was deployed defending this country? Before Morrison could answer, the door opened again and Maria Rodriguez entered with 2 young children in tow. She was a small woman, probably in her early 30s, but she carried herself with the strength that military spouses develop through necessity. Her children, a boy and a girl who looked to be maybe 6 and 8 years old, stayed close to her sides. Commander Rodriguez immediately approached his sister-in-law. "Maria, I'm glad you came. Admiral Thompson, this is my sister-in-law, Maria Rodriguez." Maria looked around the facility, taking in the assembled group of military personnel and the tension that filled the air. "Commander Rodriguez told me what's been happening here. Mr. Morrison, I want to know exactly how much money you've stolen from my family." Morrison looked like he was about to collapse under the weight of confronting the actual people whose lives he damaged through his fraudulent practices. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I never intended to hurt your family." "That's not what I asked," Maria replied, her voice steady but carrying undertones of controlled anger. "I asked how much money you've stolen from us." Tyler stepped forward with a folder of paperwork. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I've got all your service records here. Over the past 8 months, you've been charged for brake work that wasn't needed, transmission service that wasn't required, and engine diagnostics that were completely unnecessary." Maria took the folder and began reviewing the paperwork while her children watched with the kind of quiet attention that suggested they'd learned to stay close to their mother during stressful situations. As she read through the documents, her expression grew more and more incredulous. $1,600, she said finally. "You've charged my family $1,600 for repairs that weren't necessary." The number hung in the air like an accusation. $1,600 represented a significant portion of a military family's monthly budget, money that could have gone toward groceries, children's activities, educational expenses, or emergency savings. Master Chief Reynolds was shaking his head in disbelief. "Morrison, you've stolen $1,600 from a woman whose husband is serving overseas, from a mother who's been managing everything alone while her spouse defends this country." Maria's young daughter tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mama, does this mean we can go to Disneyland after all?" The innocent question from a child who'd apparently been told that a family vacation wasn't possible because of car repair expenses hit everyone in the room like a physical blow. Morrison actually staggered backward as if the reality of what he'd done to this family had finally penetrated his consciousness. "Mrs. Rodriguez," I said, "Mr. Morrison is going to make full restitution for every dollar he's stolen from your family. But more importantly, the appropriate authorities are going to ensure that he faces serious consequences for what he's done." Maria nodded, her attention focused on Morrison with laser intensity. "Mr. Morrison, my husband is risking his life overseas to defend the freedoms that allow you to operate a business in this country. How could you betray that trust by stealing from his family?" Morrison had no answer. There was no justification, no explanation, no excuse that could possibly address the moral bankruptcy of exploiting military families while their service members were deployed in harm's way. Chief Patterson's phone was buzzing with incoming messages. "Admiral, I'm getting calls and texts from families all over the base. Word is spreading fast, and people are sharing their own stories about questionable charges from this facility." As if to demonstrate his point, the front door opened again and 3 more people entered. This time it was an older couple accompanied by a young man in his 20s wearing an army uniform. The older woman approached our group with the kind of determined expression that suggested she'd come here to settle a score. "I'm looking for Admiral Thompson," she announced. "I'm Betty Walsh, and this is my son, Specialist Walsh. We heard there's been some trouble here involving military families." I stepped forward to meet her. "I'm Admiral Thompson, Mrs. Walsh." Betty Walsh shook my hand firmly. "Admiral, my son brought his car here 6 months ago before his deployment to Iraq. Mr. Morrison charged him $1,200 for repairs that supposedly couldn't wait. My son had to borrow money from his college fund to pay for it." Specialist Walsh nodded grimly. "Admiral, I'm not mechanically inclined, so I trusted their assessment. But when I got to Iraq and mentioned the repairs to some of the mechanics in my unit, they said it sounded like I'd been cheated." Morrison was now facing a room full of military families he'd defrauded, each with their own story of exploitation and betrayal. The scope of his fraudulent operation was becoming clear, and the human cost was devastating. "How many families are we talking about?" I asked Tyler. Tyler consulted his paperwork nervously. "Based on what I can remember over the past year, probably 15 to 20 military families, maybe more." The older man who'd entered with Betty Walsh stepped forward. "I'm retired Master Sergeant Walsh, Admiral. What my wife hasn't mentioned is that the money our son had to borrow was supposed to pay for his wedding when he gets back from deployment." The personal details of each family's sacrifice made Morrison's fraud even more reprehensible. He wasn't just stealing money, he was destroying plans, dreams, and opportunities that military families had worked and saved toward. Commander Rodriguez was taking notes on his phone. "Admiral, Base Legal wants a complete list of affected families and documentation of all fraudulent charges. They're treating this as a systematic scheme to defraud military personnel." Maria Rodriguez had been listening to the other family stories with growing anger. Now she approached Morrison directly, her children staying close beside her. "Mr. Morrison, do you have children?" she asked. Morrison nodded miserably. "Yes, ma'am, 2 daughters." "How would you feel if someone stole money from your family while you were away working to support them? How would you feel if your daughters had to give up things they wanted because someone cheated you out of money you'd earned honestly?" Morrison couldn't meet her eyes. The reality of facing actual victims of his fraud, seeing the children who'd been affected by his choices, was clearly more devastating than he'd anticipated. Sandra Martinez stepped forward, still holding the paperwork documenting her family's losses. "Mr. Morrison, my daughter needed dental work. We delayed it for 3 months because we thought your repairs were more important than her teeth." Betty Walsh was nodding emphatically. "Our son's wedding has been postponed indefinitely because he can't afford it after paying for your fake repairs." Mrs. Patterson, still holding her baby, looked around the room with growing understanding. "How many families has he hurt?" Master Chief Reynolds consulted the notes he'd been taking. "Based on what we've heard so far, at least 20 families, probably more. We're talking about tens of thousands of dollars in fraudulent charges." The magnitude of Morrison's operation was staggering. He'd built a systematic scheme to exploit military families, targeting their trust, their financial constraints, and their concerns for safety. It represented a betrayal of the most fundamental values that bound military communities together. Tyler was reviewing additional paperwork. There are probably more families who haven't realized they were cheated. People who paid for unnecessary repairs and just accepted that their vehicles needed expensive maintenance. I looked around the room at the faces of people who'd been victimized by Morrison's greed and dishonesty. Military families who'd trusted a local business to treat them fairly, only to discover that their service and sacrifice had made them targets for exploitation. "Mr. Morrison," I said, my voice carrying the authority I'd developed through decades of leadership, "you're going to provide complete documentation of every fraudulent charge you've made against military families. You're going to make full restitution to every family you've cheated. And you're going to cooperate fully with criminal investigations into your business practices." Morrison nodded silently, clearly understanding that his situation was beyond salvage and that cooperation was his only hope of minimizing the consequences. Chief Patterson's phone rang, and he stepped aside to take the call. When he returned, his expression was grim. "Admiral, that was the base commander's office. They want to meet with you and all affected families tomorrow morning." $1,600 represented a significant portion of a military family's monthly budget, money that could have gone toward groceries, children's activities, educational expenses, or emergency savings. Master Chief Reynolds was shaking his head in disbelief. "Morrison, you've stolen $1,600 from a woman whose husband is serving overseas. From a mother who's been managing everything alone while her spouse defends this country." Maria's young daughter tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mama, does this mean we can go to Disneyland after all?" The innocent question from a child who'd apparently been told that a family vacation wasn't possible because of car repair expenses hit everyone in the room like a physical blow. Morrison actually staggered backward, as if the reality of what he'd done to this family had finally penetrated his consciousness. "Mrs. Rodriguez," I said, "Mr. Morrison is going to make full restitution for every dollar he's stolen from your family. But more importantly, the appropriate authorities are going to ensure that he faces serious consequences for what he's done." Maria nodded, her attention focused on Morrison with laser intensity. "Mr. Morrison, my husband is risking his life overseas to defend the freedoms that allow you to operate a business in this country. How could you betray that trust by stealing from his family?" Morrison had no answer. There was no justification, no explanation, no excuse that could possibly address the moral bankruptcy of exploiting military families while their service members were deployed in harm's way. Chief Patterson's phone was buzzing with incoming messages. "Admiral, I'm getting calls and texts from families all over the base. Word is spreading fast, and people are sharing their own stories about questionable charges from this facility." As if to demonstrate his point, the front door opened again and 3 more people entered. This time it was an older couple accompanied by a young man in his 20s wearing an army uniform. The older woman approached our group with the kind of determined expression that suggested she'd come here to settle a score. "I'm looking for Admiral Thompson," she announced. "I'm Betty Walsh, and this is my son, Specialist Walsh. We heard there's been some trouble here involving military families." I stepped forward to meet her. "I'm Admiral Thompson, Mrs. Walsh." Betty Walsh shook my hand firmly. "Admiral, my son brought his car here 6 months ago before his deployment to Iraq. Mr. Morrison charged him $1,200 for repairs that supposedly couldn't wait. My son had to borrow money from his college fund to pay for it." Specialist Walsh nodded grimly. "Admiral, I'm not mechanically inclined, so I trusted their assessment. But when I got to Iraq and mentioned the repairs to some of the mechanics in my unit, they said it sounded like I'd been cheated." Morrison was now facing a room full of military families he'd defrauded, each with their own story of exploitation and betrayal. The scope of his fraudulent operation was becoming clear, and the human cost was devastating. "How many families are we talking about?" I asked Tyler. Tyler consulted his paperwork nervously. "Based on what I can remember over the past year, probably 15 to 20 military families, maybe more." The older man who'd entered with Betty Walsh stepped forward. "I'm retired Master Sergeant Walsh, Admiral. What my wife hasn't mentioned is that the money our son had to borrow was supposed to pay for his wedding when he gets back from deployment." The personal details of each family's sacrifice made Morrison's fraud even more reprehensible. He wasn't just stealing money, he was destroying plans, dreams, and opportunities that military families had worked and saved toward. Commander Rodriguez was taking notes on his phone. "Admiral, Base Legal wants a complete list of affected families and documentation of all fraudulent charges. They're treating this as a systematic scheme to defraud military personnel." Maria Rodriguez had been listening to the other families' stories with growing anger. Now she approached Morrison directly, her children staying close beside her. "Mr. Morrison, do you have children?" she asked. Morrison nodded miserably. "Yes, ma'am, 2 daughters." "How would you feel if someone stole money from your family while you were away working to support them? How would your daughters have to give up things they wanted because someone cheated you out of money you'd earned honestly?" Morrison couldn't meet her eyes. The reality of facing actual victims of his fraud, seeing the children who'd been affected by his choices, was clearly more devastating than he'd anticipated. Sandra Martinez stepped forward, still holding the paperwork documenting her family's losses. "Mr. Morrison, my daughter needed dental work. We delayed it for 3 months because we thought your repairs were more important than her teeth." Betty Walsh was nodding emphatically. "Our son's wedding has been postponed indefinitely because he can't afford it after paying for your fake repairs." Mrs. Patterson, still holding her baby, looked around the room with growing understanding. How many families has he heard? Master Chief Reynolds consulted the notes he'd been taking. Based on what we've heard so far, at least 20 families, probably more. We're talking about tens of thousands of dollars in fraudulent charges. The magnitude of Morrison's operation was staggering.
He'd built a systematic scheme to exploit military families, targeting their trust, their financial constraints, and their concerns for safety. Chief Patterson's phone was buzzing, and he stepped aside to take the call. When he returned, his expression was grim. "Admiral, that was the base commander's office. They want to meet with you and all affected families tomorrow morning."